Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are diving deep into a powder keg that the mainstream media is packaging as separate stories but is actually one interconnected chain of escalation across the Middle East. Lebanon calling for direct talks with Israel. Iran choking the Strait of Hormuz down to 15 vessels a day. Trump strong-arming NATO allies into policing that strait. A massive hack of a former Israeli army chief's phone. And China quietly playing kingmaker behind a ceasefire. These are not isolated events. This is the architecture of a new world order being built in real time.
That's exactly right, Alex. Let's start with Lebanon, because this story is getting almost no serious analysis in Western media. The Lebanese government is now calling for direct talks with Israel, according to Al Jazeera's reporting, sourced through Middle East Eye. On the surface, that sounds like diplomacy. That sounds like progress. But you have to ask yourself, what leverage does Lebanon actually have at this negotiating table? The country's infrastructure is devastated, its economy collapsed years ago, and Hezbollah, which functioned as both a political party and a military force, has been severely degraded after months of Israeli military operations. This isn't a negotiation between equals. This is a country coming to the table because it has no other options left.
And that's the part that Western outlets will frame as a victory for peace. They'll say diplomacy is working. But let's be honest about what direct talks mean when one side has been conducting military operations on the other's sovereign territory. Israel has systematically dismantled Hezbollah's command structure, targeted civilian infrastructure, and created a buffer zone in southern Lebanon that looks an awful lot like a permanent occupation. So when Lebanon says it wants direct talks, what it's really saying is, we need the bombing to stop, and we have no military card left to play. The question nobody is asking is, what will Israel demand in return? Because Israel doesn't come to the table to give things back.
Precisely. And historically, direct talks between Lebanon and Israel have always been mediated, through the United States, through the United Nations, through back channels. The fact that Lebanon is now calling for direct bilateral negotiations suggests that the traditional mediators have either failed or stepped aside. The United States under Trump has made it abundantly clear that it views Israel as a strategic partner with essentially no conditions attached. So Lebanon can't rely on Washington to be an honest broker. The UN has been sidelined. That leaves Lebanon sitting across from a military superpower with nothing but its geographic position as a bargaining chip.
And let's talk about that geographic position, because it connects directly to our next story. The Strait of Hormuz. Iran announced it will allow no more than 15 vessels per day to pass through the strait. Now, for anyone who doesn't understand the significance of that waterway, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz on any given day. That's approximately 20 million barrels. Restricting passage to 15 vessels is not a blockade in name, but it is a choke point in practice. Iran is telling the world, we control the flow of energy, and we're willing to use that control as a weapon.
This is economic warfare, plain and simple. And it's a direct response to the pressure campaign that the Trump administration has been running against Tehran. The timing is not coincidental. Iran watched what happened to Hezbollah in Lebanon. It watched its most important regional proxy get dismantled. It watched the United States provide unlimited military support to Israel. And Iran's calculus became very clear: if we can't fight on the battlefield, we fight on the shipping lanes. 15 vessels a day means delays, means insurance premiums skyrocket for tankers, means oil prices spike, and means every consumer in America and Europe feels it at the gas pump.
And here's what the mainstream financial press isn't telling you. The 15-vessel limit isn't just about oil. The Strait of Hormuz is also critical for liquefied natural gas shipments, particularly from Qatar. It's critical for commercial shipping routes connecting Asia to Europe. When Iran squeezes that strait, it doesn't just hurt the West, it sends shockwaves through global supply chains that are already fragile from years of disruption. This is Iran saying to the world, you can sanction us, you can isolate us, you can let Israel destroy our allies, but you cannot take away our geography. The strait is Iran's nuclear option without the nuclear warhead.
Which brings us directly to the NATO story, and this one should alarm every taxpayer in every NATO member nation. Middle East Eye is reporting that NATO has been briefed that Trump wants immediate commitments from allies to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Think about what that means. The United States is essentially telling its European and Canadian allies, we need your navies, we need your resources, we need your soldiers to go police a waterway in the Persian Gulf because our pressure campaign against Iran created this crisis in the first place. This is the definition of manufacturing a problem and then demanding others pay to fix it.
And the NATO Secretary General is reportedly taking this seriously, which tells you everything about the power dynamics within the alliance. European nations that have been trying to maintain some semblance of diplomatic engagement with Iran are now being told to abandon that approach and join a military posture in one of the most volatile waterways on Earth. France, Germany, the UK, these countries have their own economic interests in keeping the strait open, but they also know that a military confrontation with Iran in the Hormuz could trigger a regional war that makes the Iraq invasion look like a skirmish. Trump is putting NATO in an impossible position.
And here's the geopolitical chess move that nobody in Washington wants to talk about. If NATO commits naval forces to the Strait of Hormuz, that's naval capacity pulled away from the European theater, from the Baltic Sea, from the Mediterranean, from areas where NATO is supposedly focused on countering Russian naval expansion. So either NATO stretches itself thin across two theaters, or it deprioritizes one. Either way, the alliance is weakened. And who benefits from a weakened, overstretched NATO? Take your pick: Russia, China, or any adversary that's been waiting for the West to overcommit in yet another Middle Eastern theater.
Now let's connect this to the China story, because this is where the real power shift becomes visible. The South China Morning Post is reporting on China's role in brokering the Iran-US ceasefire, and the framing is critical. They describe it as reflecting China's strategic distance. Let me translate that from diplomatic speak. China swooped in at the last minute, made a phone call to Tehran, and suddenly Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire just hours before Trump's deadline expired. China positioned itself as the indispensable mediator, the adult in the room, while maintaining plausible deniability about whose side it's on.
This is a masterclass in strategic positioning by Beijing. Let's walk through the timeline as reported. On April 6, Iran delivered a 10-point proposal to the United States through Pakistani mediators. Pakistan, a country with deep ties to both China and the Muslim world, served as the initial channel. Then, according to Iranian officials, Tehran's final acceptance came after a last-minute intervention by China. So China didn't do the heavy lifting of the negotiation. Pakistan did. But China delivered the closing argument. That means Beijing gets the credit for the ceasefire without bearing the cost of the negotiation process. That is strategic distance executed flawlessly.
And think about what this means for the global order. The United States set a deadline. It drew a line in the sand and said Iran must reopen the strait or face consequences. And then a ceasefire materialized, not because of American military pressure, not because of NATO solidarity, but because China picked up the phone. That is a fundamental shift in how crises get resolved. The United States is still the country with the aircraft carriers in the Gulf, but China is increasingly the country with the diplomatic leverage to actually end conflicts. Soft power just beat hard power in real time, and most Americans have no idea it happened.
And the 10-point proposal from Iran, we need to ask what's in it, because that document is going to shape the next decade of Middle Eastern geopolitics. If Iran extracted concessions on sanctions relief, on its nuclear program, on its regional influence, in exchange for simply reopening a waterway it controls by geography, then Tehran just turned a crisis of its own making into a strategic victory. The strait was always going to reopen. The question was always about the price. And if China helped negotiate that price, then China now has leverage over both sides. It can tell Washington, we delivered your ceasefire. And it can tell Tehran, you owe us.
That's the hidden economy of this entire situation. Every one of these stories, Lebanon's desperation, Iran's strait gambit, NATO's overextension, China's mediation, they all feed into the same dynamic. The United States is spending military capital at an unsustainable rate, projecting force in multiple theaters simultaneously, while China is accumulating diplomatic capital by positioning itself as the reasonable alternative. 10 years ago, no one would have looked to Beijing to broker a deal between Iran and the US. Today it's becoming the default expectation. That should terrify policymakers in Washington, and it should inform every voter.
Now let's circle back to the hacking story, because it ties into the security dimension of everything we've been discussing. A hacking group aligned with Iran claims to have obtained at least 19,000 files from the phone of former Israeli Army Chief Herzi Halevi. Middle East, I broke this story. 19,000 files. Think about what a military chief of staff has on his phone: operational plans, communications with political leaders, intelligence assessments, personnel information, strategic doctrine. If even a fraction of this data is authentic, it represents one of the most significant intelligence breaches in Israeli military history.
And the timing is not accidental. This hack is being publicized now, while Lebanon is being pressured into talks, while Iran is demonstrating its ability to disrupt global shipping, while the US is trying to rally NATO. Iran-aligned hackers releasing this information is a message. It says, we can reach into your most secure institutions. Your former army chief's personal device was compromised. What else do we have? What other networks have we penetrated? This is psychological warfare designed to undermine Israeli confidence at precisely the moment when Israel is trying to project strength across the region.
And there's a deeper question here about cybersecurity that the mainstream media will completely ignore. How was the phone of a former Israeli army chief compromised? Israel is supposed to have some of the most sophisticated cybersecurity infrastructure in the world. Israeli companies like NSO Group, the makers of Pegasus spyware, have sold surveillance tools to governments worldwide. The irony of a top Israeli military official being hacked is not lost on anyone in the intelligence community. It suggests either a catastrophic personal security failure or a level of Iranian cyber capability that Western intelligence agencies have been underestimating for years.
And let's talk about what these 19,000 files might reveal. Halevi served as army chief during some of the most controversial Israeli military operations in recent memory, including the operations in Gaza and Lebanon. If those files contain communications about targeting decisions, about civilian casualty assessments, about political pressure on military operations, that's not just an intelligence breach. That's potential evidence for international legal proceedings. The International Criminal Court has already been investigating Israeli military conduct. A trove of 19,000 files from the army chief's phone could be the most significant evidentiary windfall in the history of international war crimes prosecution.
And that's precisely why this story is being buried in Western media. You'll see it mentioned as a cybersecurity incident, framed as Iranian aggression, discussed in terms of hacking and digital warfare. What you won't see is serious analysis of what those files might contain and what they might mean for accountability. Because accountability for Israeli military conduct is the third rail of Western journalism. No major American outlet will touch the substance of those files if they reveal uncomfortable truths about operations that Washington supported, funded, and provided intelligence for. The hack is the headline. The contents are the story. And the contents will be suppressed.
Now let's zoom out and look at the entire picture, because when you lay these 5 stories side by side, a pattern emerges that is unmistakable. The post-World War II American-led security order in the Middle East is fracturing in real time. The United States can no longer unilaterally dictate outcomes. Israel's military dominance is being challenged not on the battlefield but in cyberspace and at the negotiating table. Iran has found an asymmetric strategy that doesn't require a single missile, just a choke point and a calculator. And China is filling the diplomatic vacuum that American belligerence has created.
And the human cost of all of this is staggering and almost entirely absent from the coverage. Lebanon's population has endured years of economic collapse, a devastating port explosion, and now military operations that have displaced hundreds of thousands. When we talk about Lebanon calling for direct talks, we're talking about a population that has been ground down to the point of total exhaustion. These aren't abstract geopolitical moves. These are millions of human beings whose lives are being shaped by decisions made in Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, and Beijing, and who have no seat at any of these tables.
That's the fundamental injustice at the heart of all of this. The people who bear the consequences of these power games are never the people making the decisions. Lebanese civilians didn't choose to be caught between Israel and Hezbollah. Iranian civilians didn't choose to have their economy strangled by sanctions. The sailors on those tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz didn't sign up for a geopolitical chess match. And the soldiers who will be deployed if NATO commits forces to the Gulf, they'll be the ones in harm's way while the policymakers who sent them there face zero personal risk.
Let's talk about the economic dimension for ordinary people, because this is where these stories hit home. Iran restricting the Strait of Hormuz to 15 vessels a day means energy prices rise globally. That means higher gas prices, higher heating costs, higher food prices because transportation costs increase. When Trump demands NATO secure the strait, that's taxpayer money from allied nations being redirected from domestic priorities to military operations. Every dollar spent on a naval deployment in the Gulf is a dollar not spent on healthcare, infrastructure, or education. The war economy extracts wealth from working people and funnels it into defense contractors and oil speculators. That's the transaction that never makes the evening news.
And the defense industry is already positioning for this. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, their stock prices respond to exactly these kinds of escalation cycles. When NATO commits to securing the Hormuz, someone has to build the ships, the missiles, the surveillance systems. When Israel faces new cyber threats, someone sells the cybersecurity upgrades. When Lebanon needs reconstruction after military operations, someone gets those contracts. Follow the money through every one of these stories and you'll find the same constellation of corporations that profit from instability. Peace is bad for their quarterly earnings. Escalation is their business model.
And China understands this dynamic perfectly, which is why its approach is so strategically brilliant and so dangerous for American hegemony. While the United States profits from conflict through its defense industry, China profits from resolution through its Belt and Road Initiative, through trade agreements, through infrastructure development. China doesn't need the Middle East to be at war. China needs the Middle East to be stable enough to buy Chinese goods and sell Chinese-financed oil. So when China brokers a ceasefire, it's not altruism, it's market development. But the end result is still a ceasefire, which is more than Washington has delivered.
Let's also examine Pakistan's role, because that's been massively underreported. Pakistan served as the primary mediator, delivering Iran's 10-point proposal to the United States. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, a massive military, deep ties to China through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and historic relationships with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. Pakistan positioning itself as a diplomatic channel in a US-Iran crisis is a significant geopolitical development. It signals that the traditional Gulf Arab mediators, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, have either been sidelined or have chosen to sit this one out. The diplomatic map of the Middle East is being redrawn, and most Western analysts are still using the old one.
And here's what connects the Lebanon and Iran stories at a strategic level that nobody is discussing. If Lebanon enters direct talks with Israel without the backing of Iran or Hezbollah, that effectively severs the northern link in Iran's so-called axis of resistance. Iran built a strategic arc from Tehran through Baghdad through Damascus to Beirut over decades. That arc has been shattered. Syria fell. Hezbollah has been degraded. And now Lebanon is going directly to Israel. Iran's response, squeezing the Hormuz, is the response of a power that has lost its proxy network and is falling back on its one remaining asymmetric advantage, geography.
That's a crucial insight. The Strait of Hormuz gambit is not a position of strength, it's a position of last resort. Iran has watched its regional influence network systematically dismantled. Its response is essentially holding the global economy hostage because it has no other cards left to play. And that makes the situation more dangerous, not less. A cornered adversary with one remaining lever of power is more likely to use it aggressively than a secure adversary with multiple options. The 15-vessel limit could easily become 10, then 5, then 0. Each escalation forces a response, and each response risks a miscalculation that nobody can walk back.
And the ceasefire, this 2-week ceasefire that China helped broker, is not a resolution. It's a pause. 2 weeks. That's not a peace deal. That's a timeout. When that ceasefire expires, every single one of these dynamics will still be in play. Iran will still control the strait. NATO will still be under pressure to commit forces. Lebanon will still be negotiating from weakness. China will still be accumulating leverage. And those 19,000 files from Halevi's phone will still be out there, being analyzed, potentially being leaked piece by piece for maximum political damage. 2 weeks buys time. It solves nothing.
So what should you, our viewers, take away from all of this? First, stop consuming these stories as separate events. They are one story, the story of a regional order collapsing and a new one being born in chaos. Second, follow the money. Every escalation benefits someone. Every military deployment enriches someone. Every ceasefire creates new leverage for someone. Ask who profits. Third, demand better from your media. If your news source is giving you the Lebanon talk story without connecting it to the Hormuz crisis, without connecting it to the NATO pressure, without connecting it to China's rising diplomatic role, that source is not informing you. It's managing you.
And fourth, and this is the most important point, demand accountability from your elected officials. If your representative votes to fund a naval deployment to the Strait of Hormuz, ask them, what's the exit strategy? What's the cost? Who benefits? If your government is supporting Israel's position in Lebanon talks, ask, what conditions are being attached? What humanitarian guarantees are being demanded? If your tax dollars are flowing to this escalation cycle, you have every right to know where they're going and what they're buying. Democracy only works when citizens ask uncomfortable questions. And right now, the questions are very uncomfortable.
One more thing before we close. Those 19,000 files. Regardless of how they were obtained, if they contain evidence of war crimes, evidence of targeting civilians, evidence of political manipulation of military operations, that information belongs to the public. It belongs to the families of the victims. It belongs to the courts. We've seen this before with WikiLeaks, with the Pentagon Papers, with Snowden. The method of acquisition does not negate the truth of the content. And any media organization that dismisses those files because they were obtained by Iranian-aligned hackers is choosing to protect power rather than inform the public.
That's the core truth of everything we've covered tonight. Power protects itself. It protects itself through military force in Lebanon. It protects itself through economic coercion in the Strait of Hormuz. It protects itself through alliance pressure in Nato. It protects itself through diplomatic maneuvering in Beijing. And it protects itself through information suppression when inconvenient truths emerge from hacked phones. Your job as a citizen, as a human being, is to see through all of it. Read beyond the headlines. Connect the dots they don't want you to connect. And never, ever accept the narrative that any of this is too complicated for you to understand. It's not complicated. It's deliberately obscured. There's a difference.
This has been Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. Do your own research. Verify what we've told you tonight. Read the Middle East Eye reporting. Read the South China Morning Post analysis. Cross-reference everything. And then talk about it, with your family, your co-workers, your community. The most dangerous thing to the powerful is an informed public that refuses to be silent. We'll see you next time. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. Stay free.